On a humid summer night in Dallas, Texas, in 1997, 23-year-old Angela Martinez kissed her infant daughter goodnight, locked the doors of her modest apartment on Maple Avenue, and went to sleep. By morning, she would be dead. Her killer would walk free, and for 27 years, her family would wait for answers that seemed like they might never come. The case would grow cold. The evidence would sit in boxes, and somewhere in Dallas, someone who knew exactly what happened that night would go about their life as if nothing had ever occurred. But in 2024, everything changed. 2 arrests would shock a community that had long forgotten Angela's name. The question that haunted investigators for nearly 3 decades would finally have an answer. Who killed Angela Martinez, and why did it take so long to bring them to justice? Dallas in 1997 was a city in transition. The economy was booming. New construction cranes dotted the skyline like metal sentries watching over a city rushing headlong into prosperity. But not all of Dallas gleamed. In the Oak Cliff neighborhood, south of the Trinity River, older apartment complexes housed working families struggling to keep pace with the city's rapid growth. The Maple Grove apartments sat on a tree-lined street that had seen better days. Built in the 1970s, the 2-story brick buildings surrounded a courtyard with a swimming pool that no longer worked and playground equipment rusted by years of Texas heat and afternoon thunderstorms. Angela Martinez lived in apartment 2B. She was 23 years old, born and raised in Dallas, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had worked in the restaurant industry their entire lives. Her father, Miguel, managed a kitchen at a downtown hotel. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned houses in the wealthier neighborhoods north of downtown. Angela had graduated from Skyline High School in 1992, worked as a receptionist at a dental office, and had dreams of becoming a dental hygienist. She was saving money, taking classes at the community college, trying to build something better. In March of 1997, Angela had given birth to a daughter, Sophia. The father was not in the picture. Angela had told her mother only that he was someone she dated briefly, that it hadn't worked out, and that she would raise Sophia on her own. Rosa had wanted to argue, to press for details, but Angela's jaw had set in that stubborn way it did when she'd made up her mind about something. So Rosa helped where she could, bought diapers, babysat when Angela had evening classes, worried in the way mothers worry. The morning of July 18, 1997 was already hot by 7 a.m. The kind of sticky, oppressive heat that settles over North Texas in summer and doesn't lift until October. Rosa Martinez had called Angela's apartment 3 times that morning. The first call came at 7:15. No answer. The second at 7:45. No answer. The third at 8:10. By then, Rosa's hands were shaking as she dialed. Angela always answered. She had to be at work by 8:30. She was never late. Never missed a call from her mother in the morning. It was their routine. Rosa would call, Angela would answer on the second or third ring, and they would talk for exactly 5 minutes while Angela fed Sophia her bottle. Clear as throat, Rosa called the dental office. Angela hadn't arrived. Dr. Patterson, the dentist Angela worked for, had called Angela's apartment twice himself. He was concerned. Angela had never been late in the 2 years she'd worked there. Rosa's next call was to 911. Something was wrong. A mother knows. The Dallas Police Department received the call at 8:23 a.m., a wellness check at the Maple Grove apartments. Officer Brian Keller and his partner, Officer Lisa Tran, arrived at 8:41 a.m. The apartment complex was quiet. Most residents had already left for work. A few children played in the courtyard, their laughter carrying across the thick morning air. Officer Keller knocked on the door of apartment 2B, knocked again, called out, "Dallas Police, we're here for a wellness check." Nothing. Officer Tran walked to the window, peered through a gap in the curtains. She saw a lamp on, a diaper bag on the couch. Everything appeared normal. But there was no movement. The apartment manager, a thin man named Leonard Hayes, arrived with keys. His hands fumbled with the ring. "She's a good tenant," he said. "Always pays on time, quiet, never any trouble." Officer Keller nodded. Told Hayes to open the door. The lock clicked. The door swung inward, and immediately Officer Tran knew. She'd been on the force for 6 years. She'd seen enough. The smell was faint but distinct, copper and something else, something wrong. They found Angela Martinez in the bedroom. She was lying on her side, facing the wall, wearing a t-shirt and shorts. There was blood on the pillow, blood on the sheets, a small caliber gunshot wound to the back of her head. The room showed no signs of struggle. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The front door had been locked. There were no signs of forced entry. In the crib beside the bed, 4-month-old Sophia slept soundly, her small chest rising and falling, oblivious to the horror 3 feet away. Officer Tran made the call. Homicide was dispatched at 8:52 a.m. Detective Michael Harwood arrived at 9:20. He was a 20-year veteran of the Dallas Police Department, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a careful, methodical approach to crime scenes. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long moment, taking it in. The position of the body, the single gunshot wound, the undisturbed room, the sleeping baby. Those who knew Detective Harwood said he had a way of seeing scenes that others missed. He noticed the small things, the details that didn't quite fit. He walked slowly around the apartment. In the living room, everything was neat. A few toys on the floor, the diaper bag, a bottle in the sink. Mail on the kitchen counter, bills mostly unopened. He opened the refrigerator. Milk, eggs, baby formula, leftover Chinese food in a container. He checked the front door lock. No scratches, no damage. He examined the windows, all locked from the inside. He returned to the bedroom, knelt beside the body, studied the wound. Small caliber, he thought, maybe a .22 or .25, close range. The victim had been shot while lying in bed, likely asleep. The pillow showed powder burns. This was an execution, but who had killed Angela Martinez? And why? The crime scene technicians arrived. Photographs were taken. Evidence was bagged. The medical examiner's office removed the body at 11:15 a.m. Rosa Martinez arrived at the apartment complex at 11:30, her husband Miguel beside her, both of them pale and trembling. Detective Harwood met them in the parking lot. He told them what they already knew in their hearts. Angela was dead. Sophia was safe, unharmed, being examined by paramedics as a precaution. Rosa collapsed into her husband's arms. The sound she made was not quite a scream, not quite a sob. It was something primal, the sound of a mother's world ending. Detective Harwood asked questions. Gently. Who were Angela's friends? Did she have any enemies? Was there anyone who might want to hurt her? Rosa shook her head. Angela was quiet, kept to herself. She went to work, came home, took care of Sophia. She had a few friends from high school, but they'd mostly drifted apart. No enemies. No one. Miguel asked about the father of the baby. Rosa looked at her husband, then at the detective. She didn't know much. Angela hadn't wanted to talk about it. His name was David. David Lopez. They dated for a few months the previous year. It had ended badly. Angela had been upset but wouldn't give details. Miguel had wanted to confront the man, but Angela had begged him not to. She wanted to handle it herself, she'd said. Detective Harwood wrote down the name. David Lopez. He asked for a description. Rosa hesitated. She'd only met him once briefly, early 20s. Hispanic, average height, worked construction, she thought, drove a black truck. She didn't know where he lived. Angela had never brought him to the family home. It had all been so brief, Rosa said. A few months and then it was over, and then Angela was pregnant and David was gone. The search for David Lopez began that afternoon. By evening, detectives had located him through DMV records. David Anthony Lopez, 24 years old, last known address in East Dallas. Detective Harwood and his partner, Detective Sharon Reeves, drove to the address at 6:30 p.m. It was a small house on Canton Street, paint peeling, yard overgrown. They knocked. A woman answered, middle-aged, suspicious. David's mother. She said David didn't live there anymore. Hadn't for months. She didn't know where he was, didn't want to know. He was trouble, she said. Always had been. The detectives left a card, asked her to call if she heard from him. They searched through the night, checked known associates, called construction companies. By midnight they had nothing. David Lopez had seemingly vanished. No current address. No phone number. No employment records in the past 6 months. It was as if he disappeared into the sprawling expanse of Dallas, just another face in a city of over 1 million people. Part 2. The investigation, the search for David Lopez, consumed the Dallas Police Department's Homicide Division for the next 2 weeks. Detectives canvassed the Maple Grove apartments, knocked on every door, asked if anyone had seen anything unusual on the night of July 17th or the morning of July 18th. Most residents shook their heads. A few remembered Angela. Quiet girl, they said, sweet, kept to herself. No one remembered seeing any visitors. No one heard a gunshot, but that wasn't unusual, one resident noted. The apartments were old, walls thick. People kept their air conditioners running full blast in summer. Windows closed, television on. You could fire a cannon in one apartment, he said, and the neighbors might not hear it. The medical examiner's report came back on July 21st. Angela Martinez had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. Small caliber bullet, likely a .22. Time of death estimated between midnight and 3 a.m. On July 18th, no signs of sexual assault, no defensive wounds. Toxicology was clean. She had been asleep when she was killed. The bullet had been recovered from the wall behind the bed. It was badly damaged, making ballistics comparison difficult, but possible if they found the weapon. Detective Harwood studied the evidence. The locked doors and windows bothered him. Either Angela had known her killer and let them in, or the killer had a key. He requested records from the apartment management. Leonard Hayes provided a list of all keys issued for apartment 2B, 1 key to Angela. 1 spare kept in the office. That was it. Detective Harwood asked if anyone else could have accessed the spare. Hayes looked uncomfortable. Sometimes, he admitted, if a resident locked themselves out, he'd let them borrow the spare. Had he ever lent the spare for 2B, he'd have to check the logs. The logs, when produced, showed no record of the spare being borrowed. Clear's throat, but Detective Harwood noticed something. The log was handwritten, entries could be missed. He asked Hayes directly, "Do you remember ever giving the spare key to anyone for apartment 2B? Hayes thought for a moment. "There was one time," he said, "maybe 6-7 months ago, a guy had come to the office. Said he was Angela's boyfriend, that she'd locked herself out and sent him to get the spare. Hayes had given it to him. Had he gotten it back?" Hayes nodded. "Yeah, the guy brought it back about an hour later." "What did the guy look like?" Hayes squinted, trying to remember. Hispanic, he thought, early 20s, driving a black truck. He'd seemed legit. Knew Angela's name, knew which apartment. Hayes had figured it was fine. Detective Harwood asked if Hayes would recognize the man. "Maybe," Hayes said. They brought in a sketch artist. Hayes described the man as best he could. The sketch showed a young Hispanic male, short dark hair, no distinguishing features. It could have been 1,000 different men in Dallas. But it matched the vague description Rosa Martinez had given of David Lopez. A breakthrough came on July 28th. A woman named Carmen Ruiz called the police tip line. She said she'd been friends with Angela in high school. They'd lost touch over the years but had reconnected briefly in 1996. Angela had told her about David, told her things that worried Carmen. David was possessive, Angela had said, jealous. He didn't like her going out with friends, didn't like her talking to other men. When Angela had gotten pregnant, David had been angry. He'd accused her of trapping him, said he didn't want a kid. Angela had ended the relationship and David had threatened her, told her she'd regret it. Carmen had urged Angela to go to the police, but Angela had refused. She'd said David was all talk, that he'd calm down, that she could handle it. Detective Harwood took Carmen's statement, asked why she hadn't come forward sooner. Carmen looked down at her hands. She'd only heard about Angela's death the day before, she said. She'd been out of town, staying with family in Houston. Hadn't seen the news. A mutual friend had called her. As soon as Carmen heard, she knew she had to call the police. David Lopez moved from person of interest to prime suspect. The search intensified. Detectives checked homeless shelters, bus stations, asked patrol officers to keep an eye out. They interviewed everyone who'd ever worked with David Lopez. A former supervisor at a construction company said David had been fired 6 months earlier for not showing up to work. Unreliable, the supervisor said. Temper problems. Got into fights with other workers. The supervisor hadn't been surprised when David stopped showing up. Good riddance, he said. On August 4th, nearly 3 weeks after the murder, a patrol officer spotted a black pickup truck matching the description parked outside a convenience store in South Dallas. The officer ran the plates. Registered to David Lopez, the officer called for backup. Detectives Harwood and Reeves arrived within 15 minutes. They waited. 20 minutes later, a young Hispanic man exited the store carrying a bag. He walked toward the truck. Detective Harwood approached, badge out. David Lopez. The man froze. For a moment, Detective Harwood thought he might run. But then Lopez nodded. Yeah, that's me. They arrested him at 3:45 p.m. Read him his rights. Lopez was silent during the drive to the station. In the interrogation room, he sat with his arms crossed, eyes down. Detective Harwood placed a photograph of Angela Martinez on the table. You know her? Lopez glanced at the photo. Yeah. We dated. When's the last time you saw her? Lopez shrugged. Long time, maybe January, February. You know she's dead. Lopez's expression didn't change. I heard. Where were you on the night of July 17th? Home. Can anyone confirm that? I was alone. You live alone, staying with a friend. He was out that night. What friend? Lopez hesitated, gave a name. Detectives would check the alibi later. It wouldn't hold up. The friend would say David was staying with him, but that he couldn't confirm where David was on the night in question. Detective Harwood leaned forward. Did you kill Angela Martinez? Lopez looked up, met the detective's eyes. No. His voice was flat, emotionless. Those who have interviewed suspects in murder cases know that reaction, or lack thereof, can be telling. Grief, shock, anger. These are normal responses to learning someone you once cared about is dead. David Lopez showed none of these. He showed nothing. They held him for 48 hours, searched his truck, found no weapon, no blood, no physical evidence linking him to the crime. His fingerprints were not found in Angela's apartment. They searched the friend's house where Lopez claimed to be staying. Nothing. On August 6th, they had to release him. They didn't have enough. No murder weapon, no witnesses, no forensic evidence. Just suspicion and circumstance. David Lopez walked out of the Dallas Police Department headquarters at 10 a.m., got into his truck and drove away. Detective Harwood watched him go. He knew in his gut that David Lopez had killed Angela Martinez, but knowing and proving were two different things. The case remained open, but without new evidence, there was nowhere else to go. Weeks turned into months, tips dried up, the media moved on, the case grew cold. In the following year, Detective Harwood would return to the file periodically, reread witness statements, study the crime scene photos, look for something he'd missed, but there was nothing. David Lopez remained free. In 1999, Detective Harwood retired. The case passed to other detectives. By 2000, the Angela Martinez murder was just another unsolved homicide in a city with too many of them. The file went into storage. Rosa and Miguel Martinez moved from Dallas to San Antonio, unable to bear living in a city that held so many painful memories. They took Sophia with them, raised her as their own daughter. Life went on as it always does, but Angela was not forgotten. Part 3. The silence. 23 years passed. Sophia Martinez grew up in San Antonio, raised by her grandparents, knowing that her mother had been murdered when she was just an infant. Rosa told her the story when Sophia was 12 years old. Told her about Angela's dreams, her kindness, her love for her baby daughter. Told her about the man named David Lopez, who the police believed had killed her mother, but who had never been charged, never been brought to justice. Sophia had nightmares for months after learning the truth. She would wake in the darkness, heart pounding, imagining a man with no face standing over her mother's bed, imagining the sound of a gunshot, imagining her mother's last moment. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the terrible weight of suspicion without proof, you understand the torment Rosa and Miguel lived with. They knew David Lopez had killed their daughter, but knowing wasn't enough. The law required proof, and proof had never materialized. Miguel would sometimes drive back to Dallas, would park outside places where he'd heard David Lopez might be working, might be living. He would sit in his car and watch, and he would imagine what he might do if he ever came face to face with the man who had taken his daughter from him. But he never acted on those dark impulses. Rosa begged him not to. Violence would not bring Angela back, she said. It would only destroy what was left of their family. In 2015, Sophia graduated from high school. She had become a serious, quiet young woman, beautiful like her mother, with the same determination and stubborn set to her jaw. She enrolled at the University of Texas at San Antonio, studying criminal justice. Rosa knew why. Sophia wanted to understand. Wanted to find a way, somehow, to bring justice for the mother she'd never known. Sophia would sometimes call the Dallas Police Department, asking about the case. She was always polite, always patient. The detectives she spoke to were kind but offered little hope. The case was cold. DNA evidence had been limited. There had been no new leads in over a decade. But they assured her the case was not closed. It would remain open until it was solved or until all possibilities were exhausted. In the summer of 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Sophia was home in San Antonio, taking online classes. She spent hours in her room, researching cold cases, reading about advances in forensic technology. She learned about genealogical DNA, about how investigators were using public DNA databases to solve decades-old crimes. She called the Dallas Police Department again, spoke to a detective in the cold case unit, asked if they'd considered using genetic genealogy on her mother's case. The detective was patient. He explained that there had been very limited DNA evidence in her mother's case. No biological material from the killer. No blood, no hair, no skin cells that could be definitively attributed to the perpetrator. Sophia thanked him and hung up, but she didn't give up. Clear's throat, she started researching David Lopez. Social media, public records, anything she could find online. She discovered he was still living in Dallas. He'd been arrested twice for domestic violence in the intervening years, once in 2003 and once in 2011. Both times, the charges had been dropped. Both times, the women involved had declined to testify. Sophia found Lopez's Facebook profile. His profile was sparse, privacy settings tight, but she could see his profile picture. A man in his late 40s now, heavier than he'd been in 1997, hair thinning. But the eyes were the same, cold, flat. She stared at the photo for a long time, this man who had likely killed her mother, who had walked free for over 2 decades. In October 2023, something changed. A woman named Jessica Campos walked into the Dallas Police Department headquarters. She was 38 years old, worked as a nurse, and she had information about a murder that occurred in 1997. She told the desk sergeant she needed to speak to a detective working cold cases. The sergeant called upstairs. Detective Raymond Chen came down. He'd been with the cold case unit for 5 years, had worked on dozens of unsolved homicides. Jessica Campos sat across from him in a small interview room and began to talk. She said she'd known David Lopez in the late 1990s. They'd been friends, part of the same social circle. She'd known about Angela Martinez, knew David had dated her. On July 18, 1997, the morning after Angela was killed, Jessica had seen David. This detail she remembered clearly because of what happened later that day, learning that Angela had been found dead. David had shown up at her apartment around 10 a.m. He'd seemed agitated, nervous, kept pacing. Jessica had asked him what was wrong. David had said he'd done something stupid. He'd gone to see Angela the night before, he said. They'd argued. Things had gotten out of control. Jessica had asked what he meant. David had shaken his head, said he couldn't talk about it, said he needed to leave Dallas for a while. Then he'd left. Jessica hadn't thought much of it at the time. She and David weren't that close. But later that evening, she'd heard about Angela's murder. She'd felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Detective Chen listened carefully. He asked why Jessica was coming forward now, 26 years later. Jessica looked down at her hands. She'd been too afraid at the time, she said. David had a temper. She'd heard rumors about him, about violence. She'd convinced herself that what David had told her didn't mean anything, that it was just a coincidence. But over the years, it had haunted her. She'd gotten married, had children. She'd become a nurse, dedicated her life to helping people. And she couldn't shake the feeling that by staying silent, she'd failed Angela Martinez, failed her family. She'd recently been diagnosed with breast cancer. She was going through treatment, facing her own mortality. And she realized she couldn't die carrying this secret. She had to tell the truth. Detective Chen took her statement, asked if she'd be willing to testify if charges were filed. Jessica nodded. She would do whatever was necessary. Detective Chen thanked her. After she left, he pulled the Angela Martinez file, read through it carefully. Jessica Campos's statement was significant, but by itself, it wasn't enough to bring charges. It was hearsay, a statement David Lopez had allegedly made 26 years ago. Defense attorneys would tear it apart, but it was a start. It was something new. The case came back to life. Part 4. The revelation. Detective Chen reached out to the Texas Rangers. They had a cold case unit with more resources, more reach. In January 2024, Texas Ranger Lieutenant Sarah Vega was assigned to review the Angela Martinez case. She went through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every lead that had been pursued and abandoned over the years. She interviewed Rosa and Miguel Martinez in San Antonio, interviewed Sofia, now 26 years old. She interviewed Carmen Ruiz, who had told police about David Lopez's threats back in 1997. And she interviewed Jessica Campos again, this time recording a formal statement that could be used in court. Ranger Vega then did something that earlier investigators hadn't been able to do. She used modern database systems to cross-reference David Lopez with other crimes. She discovered that in 2003, when Lopez had been arrested for domestic violence, he'd been in possession of a firearm, a .22 caliber handgun. The gun had been confiscated as part of the arrest, but had been returned to Lopez after the charges were dropped. Ranger Vega requested the ballistics records from that firearm. The Dallas Police Department had retained the records in their database. She requested a comparison with the bullet recovered from Angela Martinez's bedroom wall in 1997. The comparison took weeks. The bullet from 1997 was badly damaged, and the comparison wasn't perfect. But there were enough unique characteristics, striations, rifling patterns, to determine that the bullet was consistent with having been fired from the .22 handgun confiscated from David Lopez in 2003. It wasn't definitive proof, but combined with Jessica Campos's testimony and the circumstantial evidence, it was enough. On March 15, 2024, Ranger Vega obtained an arrest warrant for David Lopez on charges of first-degree murder. The arrest occurred on March 18, 2024, at 7 a.m. David Lopez was still living in Dallas, working sporadically as a handyman. A team of officers and Texas Rangers arrived at his apartment. Lopez answered the door in his boxers and a t-shirt, eyes bleary. They placed him under arrest. He didn't resist, didn't say a word. As they led him to the patrol car, neighbors watched from windows and doorways. One woman who'd lived in the same complex for 10 years would later tell reporters that Lopez had always made her uncomfortable. There was something off about him, she said, something cold. The arrest made headlines across Dallas. 27-year-old cold case solved. Arrest made in 1997 murder of young mother. Local news channels ran stories showing photographs of Angela Martinez, young and smiling, holding her infant daughter. They interviewed Rosa and Miguel Martinez, who stood on their porch in San Antonio, holding hands, tears streaming down their faces. "We never gave up hope," Rosa said. "We knew this day would come. We knew God would bring justice for our Angela." But the story wasn't finished. As detectives continued investigating David Lopez's life over the past 2 decades, they uncovered something unexpected. In 2011, the year of his second domestic violence arrest, Lopez had been living with a woman named Maria Santos. Maria had filed charges against Lopez after he'd assaulted her, but she dropped them before trial. Detectives located Maria, now living in Houston. She agreed to speak with them. What she told them opened a new dimension to the case. Maria said that David had confessed to her about Angela. It was late one night in 2010, she said. David had been drinking. They'd been arguing about something, she couldn't even remember what. And suddenly, David had erupted. He'd screamed at her that she didn't know what he was capable of, that he'd killed before and could kill again. Maria had been terrified. She'd asked what he meant, and David had told her about a girl named Angela who he'd gotten pregnant, who he'd tried to control but who'd pushed him away. He'd gone to her apartment one night, he said. He'd let himself in with a key he'd had copied months before. She'd been asleep. He'd brought a gun. He'd stood over her bed for a long time, he said, watching her sleep. And then he'd shot her, 1 bullet to the head. She'd never even woken up. He'd left the baby alive, he said, because he wasn't a monster. He'd locked the door behind him and left. Clear as throat, Maria had broken up with David the next day. She'd been too afraid to go to the police. She'd moved to Houston, changed her phone number, tried to forget, but she'd never forgotten. And now, with David's arrest, she was willing to testify. She'd been haunted by what he'd told her for over a decade. If her testimony could help convict him, she would do it. On April 2, 2024, a grand jury indicted David Lopez for the first-degree murder of Angela Martinez. But there was more. Based on Maria Santos's testimony about Lopez's confession, investigators began looking at unsolved cases in Dallas around the time of Angela's murder. They discovered something chilling. In September 1998, a woman named Linda Tran, 28 years old, had been found shot to death in her apartment in North Dallas. Single gunshot wound to the head. Small caliber bullet, likely a .22. No signs of forced entry. The case had never been solved. Detectives interviewed people who had known Linda. They discovered that Linda had briefly dated David Lopez in early 1998. The relationship had ended badly. Linda had told friends that David frightened her. On April 15, 2024, David Lopez was charged with a second count of first-degree murder, this time for the death of Linda Tran. The community was shocked. 2 murders. 2 young women who had been involved with the same man. 2 lives snuffed out by the same cold calculation. Those who had known David Lopez over the years came forward with stories. A pattern emerged. David was possessive, controlling, violent. Multiple women told police about relationships with him that had ended with threats, with fear, with restraining orders that David had violated. The trial for Angela Martinez's murder began on September 10, 2024. The courtroom was packed. Rosa and Miguel Martinez sat in the front row, Sophia between them, holding both their hands. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Jessica Campos testified about David's statement on the morning after the murder. Maria Santos testified about David's confession. The ballistics expert testified about the comparison between the bullet from Angela's wall and the gun David had owned. Carmen Ruiz testified about David's threats against Angela. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but it was overwhelming in its cumulative weight. David Lopez's defense attorney argued that the case was built on decades-old memories and unreliable witnesses. He pointed out that the ballistics evidence was not definitive. He suggested that Jessica Campos and Maria Santos were seeking attention, that their testimonies were fabricated. He argued that there was no physical evidence directly linking David Lopez to the crime scene, but the jury didn't need physical evidence. They needed to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that David Lopez had killed Angela Martinez. And after 8 days of testimony, after 6 hours of deliberation, they believed. On September 20, 2024, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Rosa Martinez collapsed in her husband's arms, sobbing. Sofia sat with her hands over her face, shoulders shaking. In the defendant's chair, David Lopez showed no reaction. The same flat, emotionless expression he'd worn for 27 years. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge gave him life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial for Linda Tran's murder is scheduled for 2025. Closing the Angela Martinez case is a stark reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied. For 27 years, a mother's voice went unheard. For 27 years, a killer walked free. But the weight of truth is patient, and the courage of women like Jessica Campos and Maria Santos, who finally chose to speak, brought that truth into the light. Angela Martinez was 23 years old when her life was stolen from her. She never got to see her daughter grow up, never got to achieve her dreams, never got to grow old. But her memory persisted. Her family never stopped fighting. And in the end, Angela got her justice. Her daughter, Sofia, stood outside the courthouse after the verdict and said simply, "My mother can rest now. We all can." If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.